Hi, I'm Wendy Martin, and I'm director of the Transdisciplinary Studies program. And we have a very exciting panel today, one that I have been looking forward to for a long time. It grew out of a lecture that Steve Hindle gave here at Claremont Graduate University last spring. We got into a very lively discussion about the archives and the role of technology in the archives, and I thought it would make a wonderful topic for a future conversation, and hence this panel was born. I'm very grateful to everybody for participating today. It really is an exciting group of speakers. The topic today is digital scholarship, online libraries, archives, and the future of scholarly publishing. Recent technological changes have made an enormous difference in the way scholarship can be and will be conducted going forward. Our ability to store books, manuscripts, images, 3D scans is increasing exponentially. Now, people often use this word increasing exponentially. It's often used in very casual ways, but in this instance, it is a technologically correct phrase. The question before this panel is how this exponential increase in storage and ease of access will affect the archives and libraries. In other words, how will the institutions that have historically carried the responsibility for storing and accessing these materials, which are in effect our collective memory, how will they change in response to the new resources made possible by the new technology? What are the pitfalls and possibilities? What are the limitations? And what might be the transformations that will emerge? Each of the panelists today will tackle this question from a highly individual perspective based on their experiences to date, which have shaped their concerns as well as their vision of the future. So I will now, it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Hindle, who is the director, is the W.M. Keck Foundation Director of Research at the Huntington Library. His leadership responsibilities at the Huntington include the coordination of the fellowship program, which funds approximately 150 scholars each year to work on the library collections. He also is in charge of the design of lecture schedule, the schedule of lectures and conferences, and the oversight of the publications department, including the Huntington Library and the Huntington Library Quarterly. Steve Hindle is by training a social historian of early modern England, and he has previously worked at the University of Warwick, where he was successively director of the Center for Study of the Renaissance, deputy chair, and chair of the History Department. His first book, The State and Social Change in Early Modern England, was published in 2000, and it was an attempt to explore the scale of popular participation in the process of governing rural England in the period 1550 to 1640. His second monograph is entitled On the Parish, the Micropolitics of Poor Relief in Rural England, 1550 to 1750. And it was published by Oxford University Press in 2004 and reissued in paperback in 2009. Since 2004, he has completed the research for his next project, a monographic study provisionally entitled The Social Topography of a Rural Community, the Warwickshire Parish of Chilvers Cotton, 1600 to 1730, for which he was awarded a Leverhulme Trust Major Research Fellowship in 2010. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Steve Hindle.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's a real pleasure to be here. I don't think I would want necessarily to take the credit for inspiring this conversation, though I do have very fond memories of a convivial evening earlier this year where the subject of digitisation of archives came up almost as a side issue, but it's clear that it animated lots of people around the table, and I'm delighted to be back to revisit the issue. I'm here, I suppose, in two capacities, as Wendy's introduction was kind enough to make clear. On the one hand, as a specialist researcher in 17th century English social history, but also as the custodian of the research programmes at the Huntington Library. And in some respects, as my following remarks will make clear, there is a tension between my perspectives arising from those two roles. That said, what I hope to do over the next 5 or so minutes is first of all talk you through some of the palpable and in many respects screamingly obvious advantages of digitisation for somebody who wants to do the kind of scholarship that I want to do. And then towards the end, give you some pause for thought about what the drawbacks of the exponential increase in the capacity to store and retrieve archival information through the use of digital technology might be. So, I'm a social historian of 17th century England. More than that, I'm also a micro-historian. That is to say, I'm interested in narrowing the scale of observation down to the level of one particular rural community, a community in the 1680s with a population of about 800 individuals. There are probably more people in this building right now than lived in Chilverscoaton in 1684. I know one whole hell of a lot about those people, thanks to the archives that they generated, that the institutions of church, state and market generated about them and on their behalf. Much of the archival work for my project was spent sitting in the Warwickshire County Record Office in the town of Warwick, in the county of Warwickshire, transcribing documents. I spent on and off nearly 3 years doing that, sometimes longhand, sometimes using my laptop. In the vast majority of cases, verbatim transcripts of pretty arcane material. Lists of entries in parish registers, lists of accounts by parish officers, churchwardens, overseers of the poor, where essentially I'm taking names and recording other data about those named individuals. That said, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I can see enormous opportunities in the possibilities presented by digitisation. In the first instance, data collection becomes much easier once an archive is digitised. That is to say, with digital photographs of original manuscripts, I can sit in the comfort of my own study, listening to the latest album by the Chris Robinson Brotherhood, without having to sit in the uncomfortable circumstances constrained by time and space of the archive itself. And I can do it at my own pace, my own leisure. Furthermore, given the kind of work that I want to do, which involves an enormous amount of nominal record linkage, that is to say, tracing an individual or group of individuals from one archive to another, between archives, across different sets of sources, with the kind of searchable capacity that digitisation makes available, I can make connections, make links, cross-reference kinship networks, cross-reference marriage alliances, link economic relationships to kinship relationships in a way that just would not be possible. Or if it were possible, it would be much more slow and arguably random in the linkages that I was able to achieve. Furthermore, given the nature of the archive with which I'm working for this particular project, which involves a large amount of cartographic material, I can also map my sets of social and economic and kinship relations, and the use of digital technology will enable me, with the help of GIS, to spatially represent those relationships in a way that would not have been possible a generation ago. So in these respects, you might imagine that I would have had an evangelical conversion to digitisation. It should, theoretically, have made my academic life easier in all kinds of ways. I'm not an archivist myself, but it's also worth pointing out that there are very considerable advantages in respect of conservation too. once an archive is digitised. This is something I've become particularly concerned about, the deeper and darker the corners into which I have burrowed in archives over the years, and the dreaded note that comes back from the record office custodian or the archivist that says, not fit for production, is one that you tend to live in terror of. And items that are not fit for production are usually not fit for production because they've been too heavily used and aren't being properly looked after. Digitisation will obviously protect the physical state, maintain the physical state of archives. At the Huntington, there's a particularly well-known and very heavily used 18th-century collection, the Montague collection, which contains 6,900 letters. And it is so heavily used now that, irrespective of cost, and we'll come back to cost in a moment, the imperative to digitise is growing all the time because that collection is physically deteriorating before our eyes. And numerous examples could be cited of that kind of thing from the Public Record Office, now the National Archives in London, and I'm sure other members of the panel could share similar stories as well. So, what's not to like? Well, there are a number of things not to like, I think. The first is the tendency of academics to take shortcuts with the help of digitisation. There is a certain genre of scholarship. Laurianne is going to wince when I say this. She's not guilty of it, but I'm sure she knows a hell of a lot of people who are. What we call lazy EBO journalism. EBO, Early English Books Online, the digitised archive of the 100,000 books published in England before 1700. Much of it now searchable by word. A lot of the scholarship that's done on that archive is lazy. It is really cavalier in its extraction of individual examples from texts. It's the historiographical or literary equivalent of a ram raid or a drive-by, rather than a detailed engagement with the text. Secondly, there is the question of cost. The Montague archive, 6,900 letters. Last week we were asked by a team of researchers from the University of London about whether they could put us in their bid to the Mellon Foundation to digitise that collection. 6,900 letters, probably $90,000, just to take the photographs and do the metadata. That's before you've even talked about maintaining the archive on the servers. And that in itself is another issue, and I'm sure we'll come back to the longevity of these forms of technology. Third, and this speaks really to Wendy's question about scholarship and publishing, is the tendency of digital scholarship to rely far too heavily on shock and awe. That is to say, you know, those brightly coloured digital maps, you know, you've seen them in the journals. Journal of Historical Geography used to be the place where you'd see them, but now they're cropping up all over the place. A digital representation of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's trip round the Lake District in the 1790s, complete with colour-coded dots for the length of time he spent in each particular village, right? I mean, does that actually help us understand his experience of the Lake District? Well, it's arguable. And then, speaking more specifically and finally with my Director of Research's hat on, I believe that the best scholarly communities are the real ones, the ones that take face-to-face in places like the Huntington Library. It's very nice if you can sit in Canberra or Krakow and Kenilworth and access the content of an archive, and then set up a user group of individuals sitting in Krakow and Canberra and Kenilworth and having a virtual discussion as part of a virtual scholarly community. But the really exciting scholarly interchanges are the ones that are taking place face-to-face in rooms like this, where we are going to discover over the course of the next hour or so connections and synergies within and between our interests that you would never discover if you were relying on virtual communication and searching one another out. I won't because we're short of time, I could rehearse numerous examples of the exciting friction that took place intellectually between members of the real scholarly community at the Huntington Library last year that just wouldn't have occurred if we were relying on a virtual world. Independent research libraries like the Huntington are libraries of last resort. I want people to come there, to use the archive, and to have real face-to-face scholarly conversations about the issues that those archives raise. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Tammi Schneider. Tammi is a profession of religion as well as the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at CGU. Her scholarly work includes ancient history, or fields include ancient history, covering Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Aegean from the 3rd millennium to the end of the first. Ancient Near Eastern languages and literature, archaeology, primarily of Israel, and women in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Judges, and Samuel. Her research draws together the various fields of archaeology, Assyriology, and biblical studies in an effort to understand the ancient Near East, especially the interactions among various people. Additionally, Professor Schneider is interested in the role of women in the Hebrew Bible, and she has worked on numerous archaeological excavations and currently co-directs excavations at the Tel Farrell South in Israel as a project director for the Institute of Antiquity and Christianity. Her publications include Sarah, Mother of Nations, which was published by Continuum in 2004, and Mothers of Promise, Women in the Book of Genesis, which came out in 2008. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, and she is going to now have a full-time, very busy life as our new dean. So please join me in welcoming Tammi Schneider.
Thank you, I think. Well, thank you, Wendy. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So I was at the dinner, the lively dinner last year, and I was under the impression, because I wasn't paying enough attention to all of Wendy's little notes, that today we were talking about to digitize or not to digitize. And we still are, and I'm still talking about her new title a little bit. So if mine is more on to digitize and not to digitize than what the long title is, I apologize, Wendy. My take on this is pretty much my take on everything, which is context is everything. And the context in which you are doing something matters and will dictate why you do it and how you do it. This began by talking about whether or not certain libraries and collections should be digitized, and that is what I'm going to sort of cast this around. My take is that what is the context of the collection and why one is thinking of shifting the format in which it presently exists should govern how important it is to digitize it or not. My perspective on this is a bit sick and twisted. I am an ancient historian and a dirt archaeologist, and as a result, I use artifacts that predate books and writing on paper. So I know that all of these variations of conveying either written word or images is ephemeral and is going to change. And so this is the new fad, and it may last 100 to 100 years, but that's going to disappear as well. And as part of my profession, I work on actual physical artifacts that are more than just what is written on them, and is more than just the images that are embedded in them. So that governs much of how I think about any text in whatever format. It is also the case that I am comfortable in the middle of the road, and so on this topic as well, you know, I can kind of see a lot of sides. See, that's the dean thing, maybe? Anyway. So my thesis is that digitization is important because it makes accessible, it's almost a democratization of sorts, of data. It makes available great amounts of data that would otherwise be available only to a select elite. The problem is that digitization cannot replace books or other artifacts that convey printed letters or images, because books and these other matters are three-dimensional objects whose physicality conveys more than just the data written upon them. Digitization cannot convey that. It can't reflect that. All right, books are recent. I'll start there. They're a recent phenomena. So this notion of converting old data into new, same old wine in a brand new bottle is ancient as well. There have been numerous kinds of formats where written words and or pictures have been written upon. For example, clay tablets. I was going to bring one today, but I was running late. Don't leave home without your tablet. You guys maybe have iPad tablets. Mine are the clay ones. They were first used in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BCE. So that is how writing began, and you could also convey, initially, they wrote in picture signs that were then, I can only think of the word in Akkadian now, made more abstracted and turned into signs, which then eventually people got the notion to actually make letters. So you've got, that lasted from the 3rd millennium. The last cuneiform tablet dates to the 1st century CE, Common Era, right? So we're talking about 3,000 plus years. Papyrus was also possibly used for writing as early as the 1st dynasty in Egypt, but we don't have really solid evidence, i.e. artifacts, until the 5th century, around the 5th dynasty rather, around 2400-ish. And these aren't books, but these are scrolls. You have writing on bone and shell, wood and silk in China before the 2nd century BCE, and China is relevant because that's where paper was actually invented, around the 1st century CE. And the first printing of books started in China probably in the Tang dynasty, somewhere between 618 and 907 CE. Wax tablets was another format where you could write things and then erase them. Parchment progressively replaced papyrus, probably starting around somewhere the 3rd century BCE. Et cetera. So you can see there have been numerous kinds of ways that people convey writing and pictorial images as well. The invention of the printing press is only by Gutenberg around 1440, right? It's modern history, okay? It marks the entry of the book into the industrial age, and the Western book was no longer a single object written or reproduced by request, but rather could be mass-produced, right? So that shifts the notion. Some might argue it's more of a democratization of written materials, but it's only 500 years old, a little bit more, okay, because we're in the 21st century. But when you look at the long timeline, we're talking about the 3rd millennium BCE, right? Cuneiform tablets were in vogue for 3,000 years, right? So 500 years, I spit on your 500 years. Okay, so again, it's a recent phenomena, all right? So this is not to say that I am not a big fan of the book, right? I love books, right? I teach the good book, right? But it is not this thing that cannot disappear because it is so ancient. The problem is that digitization is not only about books or printed words, but also about art and other artifacts. So even when you are talking, you were talking about the letters, right? There is more to a letter than just the words on the page, right? What size is the letter? What is the handwriting like? How was it folded? How was it used? How was it preserved? How did it deteriorate? Where has it deteriorated? And what does that reflect about how it was used over all of those periods? Just digitizing something can't convey any of that. All right, so this is not that I am anti-digitization. I'm just saying that if the point of digitization is simply to convey the material, what is written on it, or the image, right, because I have my artist in the room who's not a real artist, then that's one thing, but if you're trying to get at a deeper meaning behind the text or the image, then digitization is not going to matter. That's why context matters. All right, now I'm just going to give you two little quips to sort of show you how I'm in the middle of the road and I can see both sides. All right, I study ancient cuneiform tablets. They are three-dimensional. You incise with this little stylus into the clay, and so the letters are three-dimensional. The way that you can understand what it looks like is by playing with it in the light. That means you can't take a good photograph of it because it depends on the angle that you're holding it, how the light reflects on it, and sometimes you have to wiggle it around to figure out what the sign means. So cuneiform tablets, you can take pictures of them, but you can't really convey everything that's really expressed on the tablet. It is also the case that many are broken, and so while it's useful to have photographs of them to get a general sense of them, it can't tell you how it feels, it can't really convey the color, and those are the kinds of things that help you make joins, even with tablets that are in collections elsewhere in the world. I raise this because what one wants from seeing this in a digital form will dictate what not having all that detail does or does not offer. At the same time, I am also the Dean of School of Religion. We don't have a new name yet. And we have just recently finished buying the rights to the Coptic Encyclopedia, which we are also putting online. And this is really important because the Coptic Encyclopedia is very expensive. It's multi-volumes. Nobody can afford it. And it means that only at very few universities can anyone gain access to any of this really useful, important knowledge. So by putting it online, we have democratized access to this particular resource. It also means that we can update articles and expand it because nobody's going to reprint the Coptic Encyclopedia, let me assure you. It's too expensive. And so this is a format that lends itself beautifully to being able to convey information to people all over the world who might not otherwise have access to it and be able to update it. So again, the point of digitizing it is very clear, making it accessible and being able to expand it in a place that for a document that otherwise would just sort of fade away. So again, context is everything.
Our next panelist is Lori-Ann Ferrell, who holds a joint appointment in early modern history and literature at Claremont Graduate University. Her research concentrates on the impact of religious and political change on early modern texts, theological, literary, theatrical, and practical, in the turbulent century before the outbreak of civil war in Britain. She is the author of The Bible and the People, published in 2008, as well as Government by Polemic, James I, the King's Preachers, and the Rhetorics of Conformity, 1603 to 1625, which was published in 1998. She's also edited, along with Peter McCullough, The English Sermon Revised, Religion, Literature, and History, 1600 to 1750. That was published in 2000. And another a project with David Cressy, Religion and Society in Early Modern England, a source book published in 1996. Lori-Ann Ferrell is currently editing a volume of the complete sermons of John Donne for Yale University Press, as well as completing commissioned essays on postmodern theatrical revisions of King Lear, trends in early modern Catholic historiography, and graphic design in Renaissance how-to books. I should have said that she also was the guest curator for a 2004 Huntington Library exhibit entitled The Bible and Its People, which was featured on a 2007 PBS documentary on the same subject. She's received grants from the Fulbright Commission, the Whiting Foundation, the British Academy, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Huntington Library, the Folger Shakespeare Library, and the Newberry Library. And she was also a residential fellow recently at All Souls College in Oxford. All these grants and fellowships have given her an opportunity to have in-depth archival experience, and I know that what she's going to talk about will be based on some of that experience. Please join me in welcoming Lori-Ann Ferrell. Okay.
No, I'm just going to talk about something else. We don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to reproduce some of the things that both Tammi and Steve already talked about, because in many ways I've done some of the work that they're discussing, and Steve and I work in roughly the same area of English cultural history. So in the time that I have, I want to do three things. I want to begin with a story about me, because that's my favorite subject. I want to then tell you a little bit about where I come from, so you'll know why I say what I say about digitization, or about the kinds of research that we can do and that I've done. As related to my own projects, current projects, and then give you, this was actually fortuitous, just tell you a little bit about a conference that I was lucky enough to be invited to on digitizing a particular archive that was funded by the Mellon Foundation in England. I was in England at York University at the end of August. So I'll begin with this anecdote, because it's the one I always tell my students when they ask me why I decided to chuck a perfectly reasonable career as a registered nurse, where I actually made some money and help people, for the glamorous life of a scholar, where the money just rolls in. And it's because, at least in part, because the university that I attended had a rare books and manuscript library. It was quite a fine one, and when you were an undergraduate, you were allowed to go work in it, which was kind of amazing. And I was actually sent by I had a wonderful professor named Conrad Russell, who was not a practical man. And so he would just tell you what to go look for in the card catalog, and you would go find it. So it was a kind of a funny designation, and I couldn't find it in the library. And they said, that's because you're not supposed to be here in the Sterling Library at Yale University. You're supposed to go over to this library called the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which is sitting in the middle of the campus. And I went over, and they did what I thought was a version of the kind of thing they do now when you go to the airport, which is that they made me divest myself of my coats and stuff, and I had no idea, so I had to put my purse away, and I had to give up my pens, and they gave me a pencil, and they told me to go sit in a little glass enclosed room. You would think that would actually keep people from doing this for the rest of their life. I sat there and waited, surrounded, I realized, by people quietly working on some of the most interesting looking stuff I'd ever seen, old scrolls, illuminated manuscripts. And they brought out, which, in Tammi's world would be something that was published yesterday, which was a 17th century a catalog of the offenses of nonconformists in religion, called, with a really lurid title, Gangrena. But I had never, and this will show, I feel so old saying this, I had never held a book that old in my hand before. Sorry, Tammi, but it was old to me. And this followed on a week in which, for the first time, I was taking classes from people whose books, they were my teacher, and their names were on the books, and I was already rather knocked out. They handed me the book. I opened it up, and it was a 17th century book, printed book, and I thought, I want to do this the rest of my life. And I still feel that way. So I preface every remark I make by the fact, that not only is it great to have the scholarly community that Steve talks about at the Huntington, I profit from. As you see, I spend my life trying to get to other libraries and hang out with people. But the other thing is the handling of the book and the contact with that material. I'm sure that there are many scholars in this world who only need to see it on the screen to know that they're captivated by that idea. And there's other kinds of work that are not what I do, in which that would be exactly what you would need. But I can tell you that I'm not sure I would be doing what I did if I didn't have that instantaneous, physical love affair with a material artifact called a book, and a sense of its oldness and its significance in the life of the mind that I was trying to pursue. It was an extraordinary moment, and I'm still amazed that people let me hold old books or manuscripts. In my own work then, because my work actually covers the early modern period like Steve's, and I do a rather transdisciplinary set of work, all surrounded, basically all surrounding the notion of textual information. I find it both absolutely essential to be working in research libraries, not just so I can stroke books and get all excited, or, but because I need to look at books in the form that they're in. And this is a little bit like what Tammi said. I actually also need to, when I look at a rare book, I need to see if anyone's annotated it, and I'll explain why in a minute. I might be interested in how many editions or how many reprints there are of that particular book. I might be interested in what parts of it are damaged, or where there was stop press, or where pagination didn't work, because that'll tell me something about the conditions of production of a particular printing presses. And in the world of the history of the book, which is one of the worlds I inhabit, those details, which seem so bitty to us, You know, whether or not there's continuous pagination, whether or not another tract was inserted in between two tracts at a you know, in the third edition, can make all the difference in the world in terms of what Tammi has already usefully called context. I dig with Tammi as an amateur. She's the boss and I'm just in the dirt. But the first thing I learned when I was an archaeologist, I think can be applied here as well, and that is that objects out of context very quickly become meaningless. If you find something in a little square of dirt and you decide that you're just going to toss it and someone else says, oh, look, that was a small temple of a god that you just threw out. Once you've thrown it out and you don't know where you got it from, you can't claim it anymore. You have no idea what space it occupies in the cultural world that it inhabits. And not that that was fun because I made sure that I sifted all my dirt, but I've thought about that ever since. Every time I open a book now, whether it's the Huntington, whether I'm looking at it on the screen, I have to remember the context. So that leads me to my second kind of research. I am one of those people on early English books online, almost constantly. I can't get to all research libraries all the time. I can't look or compare certain kinds of editions. I don't get to fly every weekend to a different research library, although that sounds wonderful except for the flying part. I will also point out, and I think this is increasingly important in this world of shrinking resources, I feel for my colleagues and students who have not had the extraordinary luck in getting some kinds of grants that I have gotten over the years. Not everybody can afford to go to these places and hang out. Not everybody gets an invitation, and every year the pressure on those grants becomes, you know, Steve, I'm sure, can tell you this in great detail, but I'm a peer reviewer for ACLS and NEH, and every year we get more applications as the funds to do research shrink. So we are dependent on online resources, and I am too. I use a judicious mix, and Tammi might call that being in the middle of the road, and I call that just, you know, working on both hands. I will also say that I have become an absolute genius at spotting this phenomenon that Steve Hindle was talking about. So if any of you are my students in writing for me, watch out. I can't stand word search essays where you look up the word Providence and then tell me where you found it, because that is decontextualizing as well. You know, you have recontextualized that into a search engine, and the kind of research you can do about telling me how many times it appears or how many different texts is not going to tell me that you are deeply read in the kinds of literatures that allow you to talk about Providence in the first place. So, I'm not saying I've got this like wonderful call and response. Absolutely. Say it, Farrell, sing it, right? My point is not that you shouldn't do some of that. I mean, I wish I'd had these, you know, this is the old, I wish when I was a graduate student I'd had these technologies. The way I had to slave over things at the British Library was just pathetic. So I like being able to do both. So I am neither anti-digitization or totally pro-digitization. I'm a practical person. And I want every one of my students in early modern, and any of the rest of you, to have whatever material experience with your research items that allows you to realize that it is worth going into debt to do this work and to, you know, and to fall in love like I did. So that's where I come from. Okay, the kind of work I'm doing right now, I'm working both on digital online sources and also absolutely and happily with the artifacts themselves. The place where I'm using more online resources than ever before, and I'm delighted to do it, is in this Dunn project. It is a large, very nicely funded attempt to reprint all of the sermons preached by John Donne, which we are able to actually do with a lot more clarity than the original edition of the modern print edition, which came out in the 1950s, because we have found more manuscript sermons, which we would not have found if we hadn't been in libraries digging around and having them fall out. We also are perfectly, you know, aware of the fact that those manuscripts may still be around somewhere. You find many of those by absolute sheer luck because you're just going through books of, you know, collections of manuscripts. Steve can confirm that the great manuscript collections of the Huntington yield up new information every day by someone who just bothered to take them out and look at them. They weren't looking for that. They're not cataloged perfectly. We don't know what we're going for. So some of this is accidental. We know that our information is always ongoing. Our collection of information is always ongoing. This is where, you know, in some ways, the kinds of electronic formats we're looking at now that you can add to, in some sense, nicely mirror the way we find information to start with. There's a humaneness to both of these kinds of pursuits. In my work on John Donne's sermons at St. Paul's. I am both using base text, which we have to collate out, and our primary base text is actually held at the Huntington, which makes me the point person for the entire editorial team, all of the rest of whom are based in England. So partly I owe my chance to get to work on this because of my proximity to the actual thing, which I'm occasionally asked to open up and look at in terms of questions of pagination, things that haven't come across on camera, things that people forgot when they dropped their notes between here and England. So I do that all the time, and it's a pleasant task. It's part of the camaraderie of scholarship. But I'm also looking up John Donne's ridiculously poorly crappy citations. The man mistranslated Latin with a fine disregard for accuracy. He also thought off the top of his head, wrote the kind of footnotes that would have gotten a D- from me in class. And he does it all with panache and style, which is now turned into a historical artifact, right? So we have to take that seriously. So I have to track down references to theologians that he's misspelled. I have to work through all kinds of citations that if I didn't have online resources, this edition would be finished by my grandchildren if I were ever to have them and if they were to follow in my footsteps. So again, I need the physical artifact, right? Not just for my own delight, but for actual direct reference. And I need the capacity to go look up things in ways that allow me to use multiple formats. So that is wonderful. Second project, wonderful, and it's completely different, is that I'm doing another exhibition next year with the Rare Books curator at the Huntington, Steve Tabor, with whom I collaborated on the Bible exhibit. We make a very happy team, and this one is going to be next summer on the phenomenon of the extra illustrated book. I will not go into that now because it would take me, my 5 minutes is almost up. But let's just say it is a wonderful hobby of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century where grown men bought books, cut them out of their original bindings, and replaced certain pages and put in between the pages pictures and other illustrations to make the book better than it was when they started. And of course, it's like a version of scrapbooking, and they can't really contain themselves and just put in pictures. They start putting in other things like letters and other forms of artifacts that will help to illustrate what's being written on the page of the original book. They're wonderful, enormous grab bags, Wunderkammers between hardcovers. But I'm just going to tell you one that we're still working on. So I'm not announcing a great big find yet because we're not sure. We're looking at it. 4 volumes of an 18th century book called The Memoirs of Grammont. Has never been cataloged at the Huntington. So when you tell people where to go look for it, you have to say it's the one that's next to the big cabinet with the kiddo Bible in it. On the ground, there's 4. They're all in red, and then there's a catalog on top of it, and then there's some papers, right? So you actually have to tell them a location. I was told to take a look at it in case there might be something. It was extra illustrated by a man named Richard Bull, who made very beautiful books in the 18th century like this by tearing up other books and adding lots of really expensive pictures. The Memoirs of Grammont are about his the experiences of a Frenchman at the court of Charles II, a famously libertine court, so it's very racy stuff. It's all in French, so I didn't get half the stuff, and, I was busy going through it to see what pictures were in it. I found on page 43 a really marvelous kind of engraving that I'd never seen before, which he got from a print stall. It's not an individual. It's not a single picture or a portrait. It's actually been reproduced, mechanically reproduced. And next to it, some odd little homemade envelopes that were pasted onto the page. And inside of which we think, or at least we're making sure and checking it out now, are letters in the hand of Charles II, written from Brodie, which Richard Bull bought, and says he bought. He's got his authenticity certificate, which we need to know if he's lying or not. But 2 letters from Charles II written from the continent promising religious liberty to the people of Britain if he's allowed to come back to be the king. So I'm holding 2 letters from Charles II in my hand. Okay, this is why I love working at the Huntington. In order to do this, I've been locked into the stacks, right? The place where the rare books are kept that other people don't get to go to because nobody had time to stand there with me, and they trust me at this point, which they shouldn't. There used to be 4 letters, actually. No. But so I'm standing back there, but the thing is, nobody in the stacks, nobody can hear you scream. So I'm standing. He knows. I'm standing in the stacks going, I think this might be autograph letters by Charles II, right? It looks like the handwriting. It doesn't look like scribal handwriting. Let somebody you'd pay because it's kind of sloppy. But so I call in the only curator that's around is Alan Jutzi. And he comes in, I actually call him on the phone from the stacks, come in, and Alan is a very cool man who doesn't get all excited about important things, because he would be too excited all the time working at the Huntington. So I said, I think I have letters from Charles II. What are they doing here? Why aren't they over in manuscripts? Why aren't they being preserved? And he said, oh, Lorianne, if we called up manuscripts every time we found stuff like autographed letter from Charles II, we'd just be on the phone all day long. Now, this is actually, he was teasing me. And we're having them looked at now, and they'll be in the show either way, because either they're a splendid bamboozle of an 18th century gentleman who spent a lot of money on them, or they actually are letters, and when we find out, either way, they'll be fun. They'll be like the Getty Chorus. But that, again, is something that it would be hard to imagine the thrill of what it was like for Richard Bull to make a book that contained an envelope that had a surprise in it. So I close with my final anecdote. This summer I was invited, along with about 15 other people, to go to the University of York, which is a really wonderful archive called the Borthwick Historical Institute, to talk about the potential for digitizing their holdings, their archiepiscopal records, the Archbishops of York's records, which in some areas, like church court records, they have an almost full run from, say, the 12th century through 1979, when the Church of England decided to use a different kind of system. So we had a long and hard-hitting conversation about the work that we've done in church records, as I've done, and how that would have been enhanced if we'd been able to know what was there to be digitized, how many of our students can get to places like York. And then they showed us the holdings. I'd never actually worked at the Borthwick before, so they invited me because I actually dared to write an essay about this stuff without actually looking at some stuff. They thought, and so really my mandate was, would this have been better had you actually seen this stuff? Which of course it would have been. I would have been better because I'd have had more fun. So we were looking at 13th century scrolls, all the way up, through handwritten manuscripts, through various kinds of notebooks, all of which gave us all a thrill because everybody in that room was a historian or a literary, cultural historian. And then we began talking about the actual job of digitization. What would it take? Mellon is going to pay for this. And how long would it take? Okay, we're talking, what, from the 12th century to 1979? We're talking about a project that could conceivably last hundreds of years, and the platforms on which you would digitize would change. And then, because our job was to decide what they should do first, which made us have a collective nervous breakdown. And our final, and this is my final point, our final decision, at least that we proposed to Mellon, was this. And that's why I had you reproduce the title pages, the reproduced that you got for today, from these old books I have in front of me. Since the 19th century, people have been going to the Borthwick and reprinting, kind of the way I'm doing on the Dunn project, transcribing and reprinting those documents. They sit in splendid, dusty, untouched splendor in various, this is Surtees Society, the Royal Historical Society, all of these reprints, which were released from the 19th century through yesterday, sit over in Hindle Library where you can check them out. And they actually contain a good deal, for example, one whole series of part of the Borthwick collection. So our first recommendation was, don't digitize those. People can check those out. Right? We are going to be in conclusion, we are going to be dependent on the 19th century urge to do their version of preservation for a very long time to come. So move ahead. But don't forget, guys, this is all in DA. You can check this stuff out, right? So, make sure that you look for that first, because you can take those home too. And listen to whatever music you like. Thank you very much.
All right. Our next speaker is Janet Ferrell Brodie, who is a professor of history at Claremont Graduate University. Her research interests include Cold War secrecy, war and American cultural history, women, gender, and Cold War history. Her books include Contraception and Abortion in 19th Century America, published in 1994, a co-edited book with Mark Redfield, High Anxiety, Studies in Addiction and Culture, published in 2003. And her current project is titled Nuclear Networks, Radiation and Secrecy in Los Angeles, 1946 to 1960. She also teaches a lot of courses in these topics, but I do know that her courses in Cold War history have been extremely popular with students, and she is obviously one of the country's experts on this topic, and perhaps she'll weave some of that into her talk about the archives today. Let's welcome Janet Brodie.
Never follow Lorianne Farrell. I want to start by saying very firmly and forcefully right off the bat, I am a historian who loves archives. I visit archives. I use them every chance I get. I devise projects that will force me to go to archives. Like Lorianne, I got my first taste of archives when I first started graduate school. I was lucky enough to be hired. I was in history at the University of Chicago. I was lucky enough to be hired to work in special collections and their archives, and I couldn't believe it. They trusted me with boxes and boxes of uncatalogued 19th century ephemera, and I got paid to go in the afternoons and sort through and try to make sense of these just extraordinary treasures. I would rather sit in an archive going through dusty, musty documents than anything else in the world. Except as I wrote that, I was thinking, well, sitting on a sidewalk in Rome drinking some wine would probably beat that. But there are, as we've heard at this panel, there are advantages and disadvantages of digitizing archives. And the first is a theme about democratization. Not everybody has the time, has the money to actually be able to go to an archive and spend the time that's needed there. It's rare to go to an actual archive and have time for contemplation, the kind of time you need. I know when I go, I'm just frantic. I'm at the door waiting for it to open. I race to the seat. I sit down. I scan the collection as much as I can, everything in the folders. If I can do my own, take my own camera to take pictures of the documents or bring a little personal scanner, that helps. But lots of the archives I go to don't allow that. And I can't really afford to pay for some of the photographing that has to be done. So I am madly, just frantically typing notes on the documents. I always tell students, you don't have time. You don't have time to go to get food or coffee, sneak chocolate-covered coffee beans into the locker, go gobble them down if you start to get tired. You don't have time to waste in an archive when you're there. But a digitized archive gives one more time to go over the materials in a more contemplative way, and this was brought home to me very vividly with a few months ago. I had used an archive at Stanford. It was a newly released microfilmed set of documents from the Manhattan Project, you know, the project, American project that invented the atomic bomb during World War II, codenamed the Manhattan Project. Finally, after many, many years, in the 1990s, the top secret files from that project were microfilmed, and a few libraries could afford to buy them. So I had, as usual, very little time and was frantically taking notes on this microfilm at Stanford. I used it, but then it was digitized and made available about 4 years ago. And I had the time then to look at the documents that I'd so carefully typed, but also to make what I consider to be a very significant discovery for a project I'm working on now, and that was that There were clearly documents missing, and I could tell that because I had the time with the digitized archive to look at the dates and carefully calibrate all the dates, and it was clear that two or 3 days were missing. Now, I think I know who and how, and it's important that they're missing. But I think that explains some of the value of a digitized archive. I think I might not have recognized that without the time, late at night, poring over this digitized archive yet again. On the other hand, I do have really serious doubts about what might be lost when an archive is digitized. If the scanning is not done carefully, with a lot of care, we're very likely to miss marginalia. I am a historian who loves marginalia. I like to look at what the readers of books wrote in the margins. I like to look at the doodles that are on the sides of papers. And if I hadn't been able to use the marginalia in an archival collection, I would have written a very different book about reproductive control in 19th century America. Because I was actually in the library. This collection happens to be at Radcliffe, the Schlesinger Library in the History of Women at Radcliffe College, and I was scrutinizing pocket diaries of a rather unimportant and unknown 19th century woman. The diaries, very few people had paid attention to the collection at all. She wasn't important enough to merit lots of scrutiny, and nobody had paid attention to the box where her diaries were kept because they were small and they weren't very interesting. They were not the outpourings of her heartfelt thoughts, but really lists of groceries. But I noticed the marginalia, and I started taking careful note. Little X's and little checks for 40 years, weekly, monthly, for 40 years. And with that, sometimes very hard to decipher, she had tried to erase it at one point, but the erasure marks it was still clear through the attempted erasures. What she had kept record of was menstruation and sexual intercourse, which gave me an insight into a mid-19th century American woman's ideas about reproduction, her attempts at controlling reproduction, her sexuality. And that came because of this marginalia. It would never have been picked up had it been digitized. It would remain, I think, remain lost. So digitizing the diaries they would not have yielded their treasure. I'm also interested in here's another example about why we might have concerns, why we should have concerns about digitized archives. Who makes the decisions about what gets digitized in a large collection? In an archive, there's already been a selective process, several selective processes. The woman whose collection I won't go there, but lots of people burn their husbands' or wives' diaries or burn letters. So whoever donates the collection has already made some selections. Then the archivist makes selections. And in the digitizing process, there could also be other selections made. I'm interested in networks of radiation researchers right after World War II. And a lot of this was secretly funded. It was funded openly, but it was secret projects by the government. So I'm looking at archives that what I'm interested in is not so much the memos and not so much the reports of these radiation researchers as in who was reading them, who had access to them. And that is frequently the top page of a memo in America's post-World War II documents. The front page of a document will list who was allowed to read it. In some collections that have been very valuable in other ways, the documents are there. That page is gone. That page of who could read it, who was allowed to whom did it circulate. I don't know whether the archivists took it off. I don't know whether the government censors took it off when it was being, what's the term, decensored. It may well be that it's in the folders in the National Archives, and if I were to go and get those folders, it might be lying loose in the folder. But the point is, the digitized version of these documents, valuable as they are missing one of the crucial issues for my work, and that's who was allowed to read it. In some of the digitized versions, I can see, just barely make out at the top of the page, handwritten notes about, and check marks, who did see it, but I can't read them anymore. So it's often marginalia that's lost in the digitizing process, and that is that's a serious loss. I will say that sometimes entire collections of materials are lost. I used for some years a digitized history of materials about human radiation testing, about 300,000, 400,000 documents that were made available because the Clinton administration required every department of the government and the military to release anything having to do with radiation that had been written between 1930 and about 1980, and then they digitized it. It was an incredible search engine, the most powerful I've ever used. As I said, I used it for 3 years, foolishly not photocopying, because one day it was gone. It was gone from the web entirely, and it is not returned. It is not available. That was shortly after 9/11, and the Bush administration was panicked that anything about the atomic bomb might give. That's all I can assume, that it was, absurd fears. So I'm talking about marginalia, and then at the other scale, an entire database that's disappeared. In conclusion, though, I think we need to remain attentive to what we may be missing as we rely on these digitized archives, as well as being duly grateful for the access that they accord us. So, thank you.
All right. Our next speaker is Carrie Marsh, who is the Assistant Director of the Library and Head of Special Collections at Hunnold Mudd Library. She leads and manages the services and staff of Special Collections in Hunnold Mudd. She collaborates with faculty on instruction in regard to special collections and materials. She works with students on the research projects. She develops the collections, which includes working with the development staffs at the colleges and with donors. She identifies funding sources, and she writes grants for collections care, digitization, processing, and cataloging. And finally, Carrie Marsh plans, organizes, and mounts exhibitions of special collections materials in the library and other venues. Let's welcome Carrie Marsh.
Hi, thanks for having me here. In a way, sort of feels like it's a me against them, because my special collections is an actively producing and creating digital projects from our collections. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we do that and why we take what resources we have and we're using them to digitize from our collections rather than doing other kinds of things. One, I need to tell you it's all about institutional context, and everyone on this table right now that have talked about context of documents, contexts of collections, and you being in that particular place at the right time and finding those really cool things in those dusty archives. Well, our contextual reality is that we are a large special collections in a very fine undergraduate, challenged graduate library in a consortium of 7 colleges here in Claremont. We are supported by all of them, and we belong to none of them. So our reality is that we're constantly trying to figure out how the curriculum is moving, what are the pedagogical styles and needs and requirements of the faculty and students and staff of the Claremont colleges. Special Collections started digitizing our Special Collections materials in the mid-1990s, and it was a survival mechanism. At that time, we were just that place in the corner at which nothing was cataloged in the online catalog. We had card catalogs for our access for the books, but not necessarily for the literary and historical manuscripts. So digitization was a way for us to get some institutional support that would give us some recognition for the materials and the services we had. At the time, there was 1 librarian and a half-time secretary, and that was Special Collections. And then just thousands and thousands of materials, of these historical materials, that basically no one was finding. So digitization was a way for us to get some political clout within our organization and within the colleges. What would also accomplish a couple of other things, one of which is accessibility. If there's nothing you take away from this panel today about special collections and archives, and that is what you find in our online catalog and what you find in our digital projects portals is just a mere tiny portion of what we have behind the doors. We deal with minutia. So when Janet talks about sorting through boxes of 19th century printed ephemera times 1,000, okay, little bits and bobs of things that are historically important that we need to provide access to. Digitization helps us with that. In a way, we sort of think about it, at least I think about it as it's the nice big juicy fat worm on the hook. If we can start to catch some fish with that, maybe that those few digital projects will bring people in, and then we'll be able to provide them access to all the other things that are related to those digital materials, those digitized materials. So accessibility is important. The other thing is the way that people find special collections is online. I can't tell you, every single day someone tells me, usually undergrads, remember, if it's not online, it doesn't exist. That's the world that special collections live in. If it's not online, it doesn't exist. So how do we make our special collections materials available and findable in that context? And one of the things we do is we digitize them. Discoverability is probably the key issue for us. Along with that, remember, we're always balanced on that fine edge of the sword of access, discoverability, and preservation. Ironically, all the materials that these folks here have been talking about, early modern materials, medieval materials, cuneiform tablets, they're as beautiful today as when they were created 3,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 100 years, or 200 years ago. Ironically, it's the 19th and 20th century materials that are most at risk, and those are the things that we're trying to target to try to digitize so that really terrible acidic 19th century paper in those machine-made books and those wonderful handwritten documents on that really crappy paper, that those things actually survive a few more years. Libraries have always been in the business of creating facsimiles. In the old days, it was microfilm. well, who here wants to use a microfilm machine, right? So we can take photographs of things. But what's really wonderful, and it's actually really affordable, is we can stick some things on a rare book scanner, digitize them fairly quickly, pay a student $10 an hour. They get some job experience. They get some experience describing things according to national and international standards. And then we have a set of documents or a collection that is findable to anybody, because if it's not online, it doesn't exist. We're also very much involved and want to participate with a lot more faculty in the classroom with special collections materials. We have a room with 16 chairs, so we can always accommodate classes coming into special collections, but more and more at the undergraduate and the graduates level, materials are being brought in, digitized materials are being brought into the classroom and being used in instruction that way. Students are really interested in taking materials and applying new technologies to them to try to figure out different angles for research. So things like GIS, things like data mining, and other kinds of sort of those, what we used to call the computing and humanities people, which are now called digital humanities. So our special collections is really interested in trying to get some leverage with those folks to come into special collections, identify materials with which they'd like to use some of this new technology, digitize it for them, and then that way they can use it in the classroom. Our political and institutional reality at our library and our special collections here in Claremont is that there's a lot of pressure from administration to sort of justify. Statistics is everything, right? So we basically license both primary and secondary materials. Millions and millions of dollars go into those library databases. And so at the same time, the challenge is, how do we not become just a bundle of online services, but actually retain our libraryness? A lot of people come in and say, you know, special collections, this is what a library is all about. So at the same time, how do we make the libraryness of special collections make it so that we're not sort of like this weird freak show that people go and see, this is what a library used to be, and while, you know, everyone else is doing this really exciting work sort of out in the other parts of the library. So what we're trying to do is to be careful about what we're digitizing, how we're digitizing, and we do try to be very careful. We're always digitizing color, never in black and white, and to try to get to be part of the conversation within the library, within the Claremont colleges, and maybe even on a national scale, so that we're not considered just, oh, those dusty stuff that's in that room behind closed doors where we can't take our coffee, and where they make me leave my backpack on a shelf. Let's just leave it at that for now.
Our next speaker is Jed Harris. He has used computers to augment human intelligence at Xerox PARC in the 1970s. He has worked on computer design, factory automation, and artificial intelligence at Intel in the 1980s. And as a distinguished engineer at Apple in the 1990s, he did research on the ethnography of computer use and built trainable internet content classifiers in the 2000s for Mindloom. He is currently working on a book on the topic of automation and abundance. Let's welcome Jed Harris.
Okay. All right. Oh. This. Okay. Yeah. So I am maybe uniquely, I don't know about Lauren, but so far uniquely not an archivist or somebody who works in archives. And I'm also going to look at this topic from a different perspective. My history has been very much involved with trying to understand and anticipate technical trends. So I'm looking at where the trends are taking this whole situation. So I'm going to try to look out 50 years, or maybe stand out 50 years and look back, in a sense. And one thing I want to do, I didn't have in my notes, but I think it's a very important point for people to just get clearly in mind, is address the reality of exponential change. And this kind of goes back to something Tammi said. It's true that we're just in a skin on the surface of deep history. That's absolutely true. But it's also true that the rate of change now is so high that we change more in a decade than, during the first, 50,000 years of Homo sapiens existence. Okay, so that's probably an underestimate. So just to set one stake in the ground here, looking out 50 years from now, you can expect storage and communications and computing power to be more than 50 million times greater than it is right now. Okay, so what you could, if you can store, a library currently on a sufficiently large disk farm, it'll be storable in 1/50 millionth of the space. You can download it 50 million times faster. You can search it 50 million times faster. That's not a humanly comprehensible number, but I just want to make the point that it's not going to be like it is now, right? So that's a context that we have to keep in mind for that. And I am also not going to address the question of democratization. I think that is very much the issue that arises now, today, for people who are dealing with it. And I like Janet's point about the contemplative access as opposed to the rushed access, or the ability to study it in your own environment as opposed to having to do it under stress in a different kind of environment. Those are important issues, but I'm not going to address those because in 50 years from now, that's practically an invisible point. I don't think archives will go away. I don't think they'll become less important. I think, if anything, they'll need more resources and more attention than they get now. But I think Steve's point, which I had never heard quite in such vivid detail, of not fit for production, that kind of situation. Basically, the demands on archives will increase, and as a result, the opportunity for people to hold these things in their hands are going to become vanishingly small. Okay, so archives won't be what they are now, which is a resource for scholars. They'll be conservation places. They'll be, human beings will not be allowed to touch it. It'll be like a fab or something like that, where humans are destructive to this stuff. You can't go there. Okay, so it'll be a very different thing. But digitization does raise the issues that people have been talking about, for example, that Tammi talked about. So the examples I have really show how much that's a double-edged sword. Okay, how much digitization. So a nice example that deals with the contextualness, the artifactualness, was written up by Paul Duguid, who's in information science at Berkeley. He said, a medical historian, he was in a library, a medical historian was smelling the letters. So he was getting out all these letters from Spanish towns, and he wasn't reading them, he was sniffing them. He was documenting outbreaks of cholera. When that disease occurred in a town in the 18th century, all the letters from the town were disinfected with vinegar to prevent the disease from spreading. So he could tell by sniffing for the faint traces of vinegar that survived over 250 years. And noting the date, he was able to chart the progress of cholera outbreaks. So it had nothing to do with what was written on the letter. No amount of sophistication in the scanning, color or whatever would have ever gotten that. It was smell. So this is a perfect case for why you need to have archives. But there's the other edge of the sword, okay? How long does the scent of vinegar survive? If you were using forensic techniques to detect the vinegar, how much better could you do than the nose of a scholar? Maybe you could go back 500 years, okay, or other things besides vinegar. What else could you look? Maybe you could actually find the cholera germs. Maybe you could sequence the genomes of the cholera germs. Okay, we don't know what you could get out of it, right? I mean, it's not just the paper, it's how the paper was made, it's what kind of wood it was made from. You know, there's an enormous amount of information that we don't even try to get right now from archival materials. Okay, so when we should think about digitization over the next 50 years, we shouldn't think about somebody putting something down on a scanner. We should think about something actually getting enormous amounts of information from whatever it's looking at. Okay, a cuneiform tablet, for example, I'd expect you would get an extremely high resolution scan. You could do that now. It's just a cost issue. You could actually look at you could revisualize the tablet with whatever light sources you wanted in 3D, okay, and rotate it around. You could take pieces from different storage all over the world and try to fit them together, okay. That's not done right now because of cost, but the cost is going to decrease by a factor of 50 million over the next 50 years. The cost won't be an issue. It'll be an issue of what we want to do with it. Okay, another example where this is actually happening now, it's not just my speculation, is the Archimedes palimpsest, okay, which is basically some sheepskin was bound in a book. They looked at the sheepskin more closely. They discovered, hey, sheepskin's expensive. It was scraped, not unusual. What was there before it was scraped, to erase it basically, was some copies of not otherwise available manuscripts that were copied from Archimedes' original writings. Okay, but it had been scraped to erase it. You basically, there was nothing there, and it had been overwritten with hymns or something like that. Lorianne could probably tell us a lot more about that. And so basically they put together a multidisciplinary team of librarians, archivists, manuscript conservators, image processing experts, physicists, chemists, people who ran synchrotrons to basically get as much data as they could from this manuscript. Well, they weren't trying to find out what the sheep were eating when they produced the vellum, right? Because they didn't care about that. But that might be interesting too. Probably should find that out. And so now they can read the vast majority of what was copied from the original Archimedean manuscripts. And they put all that online. So that's an example where no amount of contact with the physical artifact, no amount of poring over it as a scholar would get you anywhere near close to what the digital imaging has produced. Okay, so that's a concrete example today. But you should imagine that being multiplied enormously, okay, to the point where basically looking at a manuscript, you know you were just skimming the surface. You know that there was a huge amount below the surface. And one of the things I want to point out there that's kind of interesting that I didn't know until I was looking at this stuff today is that one of the things that they did was go out and get better handwriting analysis than their best paleographers could do using machine capabilities, machine image processing. So one of the things that can happen when enough stuff is online is you can start to do interesting analysis, large-scale analysis of handwriting evolution and who wrote what. And, you know, is this piece of handwriting similar? Is it in the same historical path as that piece over huge collections of documents? Okay, and that may even be going on now, I don't know, but I didn't realize it was underway. So my final example is about marginalia, because I think marginalia is an important issue. And where this problem comes up now is we've been cost constrained, we've been thinking, hey, okay, we scanned the book, right? I mean, we've got a nice clean edition, what more do you need, right? And that's not the way we should be thinking. We should be thinking scan every book. There might be something written in some copy of this book somewhere. Okay, right now we can't do it because the cost is too high. Reduce the cost by 50 million and maybe it's not such a problem. So an example of where somebody actually, in effect, did that was Owen Gingrich's annotated census of Copernicus's revolution of, how do you pronounce that? Die revolutionibus? Okay, hey, not too bad. He spent 35 years finding 601 copies, original copies of Copernicus's work, because there was a question, how much had people actually read it, and what had they read? So he went and found these copies. He found out who had owned the copies originally as best he could. He did all the kinds of things that these guys are talking about and more in terms of excavating archives and finding them bound in with copies of other things. And then he published a compendium of all that annotation. So if we had been scanning every book and scanning it well enough to read those, he could have probably sat down, found them all, and put his compendium together in a few years. It would have been a nice edited compendium, a certain amount of work, but he would have had access. And we don't know. Copernicus was way up there. You know, he was an obvious target. And there was already a scholarly debate. We don't know how much information is out there in marginalia and annotations in people's libraries that we aren't capturing, that we can't get access to, that nobody is going to spend 35 years going around the world looking for. Okay, so this is another example. I've been talking about vertical examples where we go into depth in what's in an individual manuscript, but this is kind of horizontal. What could you learn if you had access to all the copies of everything? Okay, so that's what they call big data. So now we're still talking about manuscripts. I was talking to Steve just before we got started. In a lot of these cases, there's the archival material, which is what he worked off. There's the material culture, which Carrie preserves in her special collections. There's spoken language, which we don't have ancient records of that, but we can look at accent patterns over existing territory, and that can be very helpful. And spoken language can't really be captured and analyzed except digitally. There's archaeological information. And if we have enough 3D data, when we're doing stratigraphy or otherwise excavating a site, and we've removed that thing and we've tagged it, we know what layer it was at. But how can we ever get back to a full visualization of the site if we don't have a 3D model of it, right? We have to have a few generations of training as archaeologists, maybe. And even then, there's forensic studies of human remains. I mean, we're getting a pretty good genetic track, and we're finding out that the genes stay in localized areas, that, the descendants of people 500 years ago still have the same gene pattern in their area. And we can do things like figure out what people's diets were, so there's satellite imaging. You can see where the towns used to be, okay? There's genomic information. So basically, all of this needs to be integrated at some level. So I've already said what I think archives will become. They'll become sites of curation and conservation. What I think libraries will become is, I think they'll become what Steve was saying. They'll become the sites where people come together and form a community deliberately because they have common interests and because they want to work together, because they want to share the experience of immersing themselves in that. And I don't think we need to make people do that. I think people have a very strong spontaneous desire. A given site will become known to be the place you go to meet these people. And there are examples like that today where they don't have any, they're sites where, like, writers' communities and so on, where people go to be with like-minded people. And these sites will have to be very diverse in their resources, in their capability, the types of people who come there, because people will need to collaborate across multiple fields. No one human mind can accomplish all the stuff that they will want to do. So that's my 50-year perspective.
Right. Our final speaker is Lauren Alfman, who is a professor in the School of Information Systems and Technology and Fletcher Jones Chair in Technology Management at the Claremont Graduate University. He is also the former dean of the school. His research interests include how software can be learned and used in organizations, the impact of a computer-based systems on knowledge management, and the design and adoption of systems used for group work. Along with Terry Ryan, Lauren co-directs the Social Learning Software Lab. Lauren is an active member of the information systems community, and he has co-authored more than 120 refereed articles which have appeared in journals, book chapters, and also conference papers. He has served on a variety of editorial boards and is currently a senior editor of the AIS Transactions on Human-Computer Interaction. Lauren was recently co-chair of the doctoral consortium for the 2009 America's Conference on Information Systems. Let's welcome Lauren Alfman.
Thanks, Wendy. One, it doesn't really matter, but I'm not the Fletcher Jones Chair in Technology Management anymore. I gave it up for, yeah, just like I gave up the deanship. Enough is enough. All right, well, I'm going to be orthogonal to pretty much everybody else here and look at, I'm not a historian, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not an archivist, I'm not anyway, none of those things. But I am interested in information. In this case, I'm interested in how we can change the way we publish things. And I have some ideas about that. I have never really put these out in a public space other than talking to a few people. So take them for what they're worth. The first piece is about journal publishing. And in my field, we don't really do books. Our books are textbooks. And most of what we publish is in journals, conference proceedings. So one of the things that really irks me about journal publishing is that it's rooted back in a time before digitization, and the publishing process was tied to a very expensive set of steps that require things to be put in on paper, bound, mailed to wherever they were going to go. There were space constraints and so on and so forth. All of those really don't apply anymore. And so, but what we do is we do have online journals, but we often just conceive of online journals as the digital representation of the paper journals. So in other words, we typically publish volumes or issues of volumes over 3-month stretches. We don't just put them out there when they're ready. We kind of do that in some cases, but not really, because it's just not done. Yet it makes sense that when ideas are current, you'd want them available at the earliest point in time. We conceive of journals as having only a certain number of pages for every issue. That's ridiculous. That constrains when things can be published, how many things can be published. There are a lot of interesting things going on in the world, but our view of journals tends to minimize what really gets released into the potential readership. And then there's the issue of versions of publications. We think of paper as this fixed thing, but digitization sort of relates to the idea of annotating, right, items that we're reading, so people will write notes. Marginalia is, I haven't heard that term before, but the point is that if an article is available, then shouldn't people be able to make comments associated with it? Shouldn't authors be able to update their ideas through versions, so not get rid of old versions. People might want to look at a history, but we have incredible versioning software even now. So, you know, to me, it just seems like we conceive of our intellectual output in such a narrow fashion. So that's my point about journal publishing. And actually, there's a subset of that which has to do with peer review. Again, I think it's rooted to the idea of communications and paper, and that's that, you know, maybe we'll have 2 or 3 people who review a document. But yes, people's time is valuable, and maybe only a few people would want to review a document, but why do we constrain it that way? We have all the capabilities to make a document available to anyone who has credentials. Obviously, you have to, you know, you want documents to be reviewed by people with credentials, but we sort of limit who can review papers. And we also have this sort of constraint to say when the thing is ready, when it's finally reached some level of agreed upon status, then it'll get into the archive. Why can't we look at the various versions, the drafts, and maybe people will happen upon it, have good ideas. You don't even have to have formal review, and so on. So, you know, my view of that is we tend to, in the journal world, we tend to rate journals so they're A or A plus A, B plus B, and so on, just like, you know, grades. But why don't we think about the actual documents as getting grades like we do, you know, when we grade papers, and let those documents grow, and it's possible that they'll eventually get A pluses. Why do we just have to constrain it to a specific point in time? So those are my points about journal publishing. Then I have something to say about textbooks, and I mean, maybe this is old hat, but we shouldn't have any paper textbooks per se. Textbooks should all be online. Now, they can be paper versions and people want to feel them and all that kind of thing, but textbooks are supposed to contain the most current ideas and information we have. And it doesn't matter what field you're in, things change. People discover new things. We're academicians. We're always discovering, and we want those things in the record. And if we take textbooks and just think of them as documents, physical documents that are very expensive, and you know that they're difficult to revise, then we're kind of missing the point. So I am a strong believer that all of our textbooks should be, as their first version, online. They should be revisable. I mean, they're not even documents of record in the same way as our publications. They're just, you know, an expression of what we know about the field. They can be personalized. So if I have my copy, I can carry on a discussion just through annotations, or I can allow other people to help me discuss my copy. If I'm doing exercises, if it's more of a, I don't know, math or science-based textbook, or maybe even other fields that do those things, I could have my assignments associated with that document. So I just think we're sort of missing the boat in that regard as well. And I just want to put in a plug. It's not a plug, but a friend, not for me, a friend of mine has been spending a lot of time thinking about online textbooks. His name's Kieran Matheson, and he's developed this web service and website called Dolphinity. It's a long story. You can go to that website if you want. Dolphinity, so dolphin with an F, DOLFINITY.net. And it's just starting. He hasn't fleshed it out yet. But the idea is that he's presenting the opportunity, excuse me, for anybody who wants to write an online textbook or collaborate in writing an online textbook with an engine, with all the web stuff taken care of that will allow you to design that book in any way you want. So, put in the appropriate, as he calls it, learning science that you want to use to convey your ideas. So those are my points about digital publishing. Obviously, my voice almost made it. Thank you.
Well, today we've heard a very wide range of perspectives. I think they've been really quite fascinating, both divergent but also convergent in some ways. We've seen that there are some very great advantages to digital archives. There's access and democratization, terms of access, but then, and that it also at some times provides opportunities for a more nuanced, contemplative opportunity to sort of live with those archives if you're working at home, and you can even study the archives in your pajamas and drink a cup of tea and let that material sink in a way that you might not be able to do as easily in an archive itself, that it has not been digitalized. There's a lot of concern, of course, about what's taken out of context, what's lost in regard to being able to see the nuanced size, the shape, the smell of the material. There's the loss of serendipitous discoveries in the archive, although there may be the opportunity opened up by other kinds of serendipitous discoveries when archives are digitalized. There's a concern about loss of entire databases, but then, of course, we've known that libraries have burned up. So there I suppose, is the potential of loss in either case. We've had a view of the future in which the speed of digitalization and access becomes 50 million times greater, which I think none of us can really conceptualize. It's already seeming pretty fast to me, but it made me realize it's kind of like the Lascaux caves, that the libraries will the archives will become sites of conservation, kind of like the Lascaux caves, where you no longer can go in because the carbon dioxide or monoxide in the human breath ruins the images. That is true, of course, with precious manuscripts over time, if enough people handle them and so forth. So I realized that possibly you all who work in the archives might be the last of a generation, or among the last, that you really have rare opportunities that may not be so fully accessible in a half century. I never really thought about that. It was a privilege. It makes you realize what a privilege it is to be working in the archives at this time. I mean, it's really extraordinary, and it may not be quite so easy in another half century. My own view is I'm a very both-and kind of person. I never like to take the sort of a polarized position. I think the two resources, both the archival resources, the hands-on resources, and the digital resources complement each other and provide extraordinary opportunities for scholars today and even more in the future. But it seems that the key issues are access, discovery, preservation, and I want to just open the questioning now to everyone here. Most of you are probably a lot more comfortable in the digital world than any of us, and I'm curious to know what you all think. And don't speak unless Brian brings you a microphone, though, okay? So would anyone have some ideas or something they'd like to ask? Yeah, Jonathan.
So I thought it might be useful to think about things from the future also, and to think about, I guess, what it would be like if everything is digitized, and if libraries themselves just become a site of preservation in which humans have limited or even forbidden access, kind of like a scientific something, like the moon. And I guess immediately I think of 1984 and the myth of Goldstein's book, and about the origin of this book, and I mean whether it matters or if it matters at all, and I mean whether books even have an identity or an author behind them. And I'm wondering, I guess a lot of you presuppose that digitizing the archives is democratic, And I mean, I kind of question that. And I'm wondering, like, what your thoughts are about that, and whether, I mean, one needs to think about the politics of what happens if we, like, do run into a situation in the future where everything is digitized, and like forgery, like if these documents, like Shakespeare suddenly, like I create Shakespeare's works, and whether this matters at all. I don't know.
Who wants Steve to?
Okay, thank you. Very, very interesting questions. I think there are two issues there, and I'll take the second one first, I think. Your point about forgery raises the very important question of why scholars ever wanted to get into archives in the first place. And in fact, it may be a surprise to some of you in this room that that's actually a relatively recent development, especially amongst historians. It was only in the 19th century, the very early 19th century, when history was professionalized as a discipline, that the imperative to authenticate and corroborate texts drove historians, under the tutelage of the German school, particularly Leopold von Ranke, into archives and to conducting original research after several centuries during which what passed for historical research was essentially derivative of other published secondary texts. So it's Ranke who goes back into the Venetian archives, the archives of the ambassadors, to reconstruct the history of Renaissance Europe from its manuscripts. And that is actually a relatively recent development, you know, in this long run of scholarly innovation. So I am very sensitive to the questions of authenticity and corroboration. And I think the materiality of the texts, which has been a running theme in this discussion this afternoon, is one very important set of tools that we have to engage in that search for authenticity and corroboration. On the democracy issue, others may have a view on this, and those who are more familiar with or confident about the progress of technology over the next 50 years may have a more sanguine view. In the United Kingdom, we talk about the digital divide. That is to say, the differential rate of access among certain sectors of the population to digital infrastructure. Those who can't afford the super fast broadband connection, those whose ability to purchase a state-of-the-art computer or laptop restrict them from regular digital access. That's true not only of individuals, of course, it's also true of institutions. It's also true that institutions might not only lack the adequate digital infrastructure, they may lack the resources to buy the relevant databases. So there are scholars in North America, even today, who work at institutions which do not have access to early English books online, for instance. Now, you may well say that over time, as technology becomes quicker and cheaper and more widely available, that digital divide will shrink, it will contract, and the process towards genuinely democratic access will be much more rapid. But I'm not entirely confident of that. Technologies of literacy have always been differentiated over time. You think about the growth of literacy rates in 16th, 17th and 18th century Europe and North America. Certain groups within the population developed literacy skills first, which gave them a competitive advantage, and they've retained that competitive advantage. And there is a digital equivalent, I think, both at individual and institutional, and arguably international levels as well.
I would also say, even in Antiquity, they had notions of authenticity, and so they would have a letter, and then the real letter would be inside, and you could tell if the letter had been tampered with by, they would write the same thing. So this notion of authenticity is an ancient notion, and I would agree with Steve. There is a sense through, you know, I go way, way back, right? And I, yes, we will be able to store more data in a smaller place, but you still need man hours, and you still need people to say that this is relevant, and you still need people to want to do it. And I am not convinced that human beings, there have always been times when human beings were controlled by Hal or by a monarch or by whatever, and there were always people who knew that they weren't getting the true story, and sought means to figure out what was really going on. And I don't think there's a difference between digitization and humankind, and I don't believe in the 21st century we created any new human emotions. I don't believe we created any new human feelings, and so all of those, you can find them in the ancient world as well, and I cannot believe that people will always be that passive and buy into that. You disagree with me. I have to leave in 2 minutes, so disagree quickly.
I agree with all of that. I think what I would say is that the issue you're describing isn't a technical issue, won't be addressed by technical factors. I think I would say I strongly disagree with Steve about the digital divide at the technical level. I think 50% of Africa will have smartphones that are as capable as an iPhone now in, I don't know, 10 years, probably less. And they'll have the internet. But the technical level won't, but skills and what type of access people get from that. I mean, I think there is some plateau in the sense that if you have enough access, you don't need to pay a lot of money for a hi-fi system anymore. You don't need to pay. I mean, there's a certain point at which you have enough, right, in a given domain. But the skills that you have to use that, and the social context you have to use that, and the political control over what you get to see, okay, because we see countries which are actually executing these programs. I mean, Iran is developing its own version of the internet. China has the Great Firewall of China. The point of that is to give people a managed reality, and the government of those countries feels they're being successful with that. And there's nothing to say from a political point of view that couldn't happen to all of us. I mean, that is a political regime that is imaginable. And in that case, there would be statements about how the world was put together, views of archives and so on, that would be entirely synthesized to fit that point of view. Okay, the US government right now is trying to make sure you can't see certain things that WikiLeaks wants to put out there, right? I mean, we're not dramatically different. It's a matter of degree rather than kind. So, but it's a political fact. And it's just what Tammi was saying. That hasn't changed in 20,000 years, and Moore's law, the exponential change in technology isn't going to change that political fact.
Digital technology is really redefining what it means to be a scholar and even what it means to be literate. Are any of you concerned on the sort of person who is now going to be drawn to scholarship? For example, when Lorianne and Janet were talking about just the pure aesthetic pleasure they were having in being in the archive, I even wonder if Lorianne, who was holding a 17th century book, if she was a young undergrad and went online and found this 17th century book, whether she'd have the same draw or not. Because there is these intangibles that happen when you're holding, whether it be the smell of musk, the marginality of... I have some 18th century books that I've actually literally have formed a relationship with someone, and I just discovered someone, I read this 19th century Paradise Lost, where someone who has been writing in the margin and making little notes, just little tiny commentaries. I finally, after a year, found way close to the binder, her name was Sarah. And I now look forward to what particular verses or highlights that she's going to have, just going to compare my own. So I'm just wondering if this is actually going to draw perhaps a different kind of a person, maybe someone who may not be as quite as sensitive to artistic fulfillments, for example.
since it was me that sort of got off on the book. I think we can also over-romanticize that contact. I mean, so I do think that, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I mean, part of our work, I mean, some of us here, is actually fueled by the thrill that we have of exactly what you're talking about. We do what we do because of that, and that will animate the way we work as long as we work. I don't think that there'll be I don't think there'll be a kind of person working drawn to the thrill of the 50 million, millisecond download, or the ways that they put information together. That will be a different person, and I wouldn't be happy saying that that's a person who's not nearly as cool as we are because we get all dusty and dirty. But when you were talking, one of the things I thought about is that we've been talking about democratization of access, and I don't think this is changing the subject. But what was interesting to me is that we haven't thought about people who don't have access, no matter what, at this point, because they're differently abled, right? We have not actually talked about people. It's not just a question of, we've worried about the usual things we worry about. People get grant money to come from Krakow. Will I be able to wear my pajamas all day long, like is my lifelong dream? But I wonder about people who literally can't hold books or can't get in the library, and we actually try to accommodate. I mean, I see people at the Huntington who bring remarkable challenges to the question of access, but I think about the people that we're not seeing. So one of the things that I'm not sure about digitization, but I think in many ways, all the ways in which we're changing formats for interaction are going to enliven, and perhaps energize a set of scholars who we have not yet gotten to hear their voices. So that part, which we used to think of would be taken care of with ramps and interesting electric doors. I think this is actually talking about something else quite interestingly challenging. And that's the kind of democratization that, I'd be willing to give up, I wouldn't want to have a trade-off there. There's not an either or there, Everybody gets to have their own communal experience. But Tony, just to finish up, I'm with you about the way that one can feel about a book. There's a manuscript, a Bible manuscript, where somebody has written probably sometime around the 13th century, the Latin word E-H-E-U, which basically just means, oh, God, And for a second, I feel like there's me also poring over this ridiculous book. And for a second, the 13th century and the 21st century collapsed into one great moment of saying, this is freaking impossible, right? And I love that sense of being part of a cloud of witnesses to the works and the text that I use. And so open that up so that some people have not gotten to be in the cloud, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm actually an IS person from Lauren Olfman's department, and something interesting that kind of came up as you told your stories was when I was a kid, I loved libraries. I don't know why, they just smelled nice and they were quiet and there were all these books. And, as I grew older and my parents went to, graduate school and what have you, they would drag us along with them. So it became kind of this really cool experience where you could just run around like the Syracuse University library and look at archival stuff. I don't know why they were letting like 6-year-olds touch it, but whatever.
One of the things got degraded.
Yeah, they did. But ever since I've moved,
fit for production now.
yeah, probably not. But ever since I moved to LA, say 6 years ago, a year out of college, I haven't stepped foot in a library, and it's hard to figure out why I even need to go. You can go to Barnes and Noble, have a latte, and it becomes a whole social experience, and the library becomes just completely out of your way. It's not close to where you are, has nothing else for you to do, it's not really a social hangout. So, that's kind of one thing that's happened. So fast forward to, what you're talking about all the different information you can learn from the archives when you bring in a multidisciplinary team. And if I'm in IS or I'm in physics or I'm in chemistry and there's just no exposure to what it feels like to be around that, and frankly, there's really no need. I could write my dissertation tomorrow and never have to step foot. And that's a horrible thing to say, but going online, right, if I did it on, say, new media, there's not much reason for me to go into a library. I have iPhones, I have iPads, there's the internet. And there's so much research that I could get done and publish and never have to walk into a library. So there's no, I mean, at least for me, I think, being Gen X, we still have that experience. We're taught how to use card catalogs. How do we address that now with like STEM, and STEM's getting a lot of attention in terms of, a lot of different people out there trying to encourage kids to get into, science and technology and all that. How do we kind of encourage people to get excited about that sort of multidisciplinary thing that you're talking about, and unearthing all that new information when it's almost not even a necessary thing to have to walk into a library anymore.
Janet's reaching.
I understand what you're saying. I think, though, that there's a way that people become impoverished when they don't even imagine going into a library stacks and just walking around and looking at the books. You don't have any idea what's there. You just know the particular call number. You might be looking for one book, but suddenly there are 300 books on related topics. You have no, and here I'm really dating myself, a dusty old used bookstore, cavernous, and you wander around and you have no idea what's there, and suddenly you just find 10 things that you can't imagine having lived so long without. There's a yes, you can do research, you can do very good research, you can publish, but there's still an impoverishment to my mind, of not having the materiality of wandering in a dusty, sitting in I'm sorry, I keep talking about dusty, excuse me, not Carrie's, but archives. It can be romanticized, but read the vast literature that's out there about what libraries have meant to people. Yeah.
I would imagine that you use the library every single day without stepping foot into the Huntington Library because of all the materials we license and the materials that we produce, that we're curating, that we're putting online, those kinds of things. So one of the interesting things right now in sort of the library world is how to make that transition from being a place with stuff in it to being a place where things happen. At the same time, take care of and make sure that you are able to discover the stuff that we need to keep, the actual physical things that we need to keep for the future. Libraries around the world are still trying to manage that transition, and we probably will be for the next 10 years. But don't think just because you're not stepping foot into the building that you aren't using the library. And one of the things that our challenge is to try to demonstrate to the presidents and to our administration is that the statistics of bodies in the building might be one number, but the hits on our site and all those licensed resources and all that stuff, that's still use of the library. And it's an important use.
There's one thing you talked about that we haven't touched on yet, and that is, I was thinking that you do a different kind of research than I do, right? When you talked about multidisciplinary, I think you were getting at that. And what I think is going to be a very interesting challenge is to recognize the ways in which you use information, or people who are working in IS or physics or math, as opposed to someone who works in what we call the humanities, and what we learn from each other, right? So we may always be thinking through books and thinking with them in a different sort of way, as a person who tried to work in a humanistic way on geometry textbooks from the 16th century. But that's the challenge of a class like this. That's the challenge of the kind of work that we do together, that we don't assess the value of each other's work based on any romantic notion of either the web or the library building or the book, but that we have a sort of healthy respect for how these work together. And I think Carrie actually got to that.
I just have one little anecdote. And a couple of years ago, I had a Harvey Mudd undergraduate class in the Humanities and Special Collections, they were looking at early printed books, so books from 1450 to 1550. And some of the students wanted to know more about who made these and who owned them and how did you get them and why do you have them. And then there were some of the students in that class who are engineers and computer scientists and physicists who were so fascinated by how did that letter form, how is that made, and why is it that shape, and how did they get those little bits in there. I mean, so they were interested in the mechanical aspect and sort of the literally the engineering of the book as a thing. And that was a really interesting moment for me because I wasn't used to a class of computer scientists, physicists, and chemical engineers. I work with a lot of history students, literature students, art history, photographers. The humanists, and that was a really wonderful moment where I realized that there's just so much more that could happen, and the point of view that those students brought to that book was something that I had never thought before. It really exploded, I thought, the possibilities. So it was fun. So I hope that you do come and sort of teach me some things. And I think it will help me to teach other students to sort of look at it from a different perspective.
It's no accident that we call history of the book. We usually use words like technologies of reading, technologies of writing. We're actually, I'm sorry, as if I ever needed one of these. Oh, but for you. Hi. What I think, this already shows that there's a lot more work and cross-pollination between the way we think about information that is going on at almost an inarticulate level, right? Or we're thinking, because we all work with computers, I think everybody here, I don't go in with a little quill pen, and scrape my vellum every day. I'm already thinking about the way I react to text in a set of different formats. That'll also make me think about the book in a different way. In a 16th century geometry book, when you go to solid geometry, your book becomes a thing which you can then build into a three-dimensional object. That was what was fascinating to me. I wouldn't have had any language to talk about that in stuff I wrote if I didn't actually talk with people who worked in mathematics and who worked in geometry, not in history. So, so it's good we get somewhere sometimes in the same building so we can discuss these things.
I've got a question about marginalia for everybody, actually. So I always pictured, if you'd want to get the marginalia, you just scan it really, really carefully, and reading some of the stuff that Lorianne posted that they had, from 2005, this written out, typed out manuscript with notes that say, ends, hand A says this in the margin. And I'm wondering, what do you think is the best way to deal with marginalia if you have to digitize something? What do the researchers want to see? What do the librarians do right now? And what's going to happen in the future?
I don't think there's any substitute for looking at the originals and for looking at large numbers of annotations and marginalia. There is a definitive study of this practice. I don't know whether you've ever come across Bill Sherman's wonderful book called Used Books, which was written and researched at the Huntington Library. And Bill wasn't interested in the content or the text of any of the early printed books he looked at. What he was interested in was reading and annotating practices. So how were books used? What sort of symbols did people put in the margins of those volumes? Were the same individuals using similar annotating practices across a range of books on different subjects? Were they imitating other people's annotating practices? I mean, that book, Used Books, is one of, is perhaps the best example of a genre that I've come to call, the Huntington book, the book that could only have been written on the basis of that collection, and literally only on the basis of a very close and careful inspection of the original material. A modern digital edition or transcription, could not possibly reproduce the hand, right?
One of the things to think about is, from our perspective, when we digitize something from the collection, we're doing it as curators. The curatorial eye is really important, so we're going to scan it high resolution as possible, 1200 DPI or higher, in color. Okay? We want to digitize it once, highest resolution we can possibly pull, and then not have to worry about it again. But when you're talking about how to sort of reproduce the marginalia and stuff, you're kind of thinking more in a production environment, sort of like the Google, I don't want to bring up Google Books, but in this instance, it probably is a good contrast. And that is that with the automated book scanner, where the little mechanical arm turn to page scan, turn to page scan, turn to page scan, that is not what we do. And it's not appropriate for us to do that. We just don't do that. We want to make sure we capture as much as possible. Even the things we don't really know that we're capturing, we want to try to capture it.
Let me just make a brief technical comment. When we talk about color scanning right now, what you're actually capturing is 3 colors, 3 points of color in the entire spectrum. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but it's very far from a full multispectral scan. So when Tammi, for example, was talking about taking a cuneiform tablet and looking at it, looking at the color, you know, just what we would call a color scan today is not something that would capture what she was talking about there. The human eye can only capture really 3 colors, but you move things between different lights and the reflectance changes and so on. So I'm not saying that if we just digitize things today, you know, just put things through today's color scanners or do the Google Books thing or whatever, that would take care of it and, you know, we'd be done. I'm saying that the evolutionary trend is towards being able to capture more and more three-dimensionality, detail, chemical composition, and so on and so forth. So I doubt there is an ideal solution or even an adequate solution for fully capturing everything today, and if there was, it would be prohibitively expensive. And when you look at something like the Archimedes palimpsest, it's, you know, a bunch of specialists working on just that manuscript to get the detail that they get out of it. And if you took all those same techniques and just applied them to something else, they wouldn't have to start from scratch, but there'd be a lot of reworking. It's not until you've iterated over thousands of those that you get to a generic solution that can.
I just want to add one thing about marginalia. One of the lots of historians and cultural studies folk and people in literature are interested in cooking and food and what people ate and how they used cookbooks. And one of the great cookbook collections is at the Radcliffe Women's Library. It will never be digitized because it's just there are too many books and too few people who actually use them. But people who want to know about how cookbooks were used, look for marginalia, and you might find a few written words, a few sentences on in every 100th book that you look at. But it's pure gold when you do. You know, oh, fiddle-dee-dee. I prefer the recipe in my grandmother's recipe in such and such a book. So what's my point? Marginalia. The ways that there will never be a digitization process that will work for a lot of questions that we ask in these fields.
I'll just add one more. Even the one thing we hadn't talked about that you also find in books are other things put inside and pressed in books. So, and that's actually, because I was thinking about the fact that, you know, you'd be able to read my cookbooks by the grease spots in them, and I don't know how they're going to do technology to get that, but it's, because we can't even get it out. But we come across things that people have tucked in, and we see these as deliberate. You know, you decide, sometimes you're just smashing a rose, but sometimes you've got something else. My grandmother's Bible was filled with other kinds of prayer cards and clippings from the newspaper and obituaries, and that is another form of, that's not an extra illustrated book. We're not going to be showing it at the Huntington Library Extra Illustration Show. It's not a scrapbook. it was a book that she owned and that she read every day, and when words struck her in a certain way, then that meant you inserted something there. That's a different kind of reading practice, and that's the kind of thing that, you know, I can see us getting a picture of it, but it's not exactly the same as having a book fall open to that. You know, again, we run into the danger of romanticizing it. I think you'd be able to do great research on stuff that you find in other kinds of collections, but a kind of hands-on work is essential to, I think, what we're doing now, and I can't imagine not having some access to that.
I can just say one thing. I think for me, my hope is that digitizing a collection will help you find it better because you're using Google more than anything else. So you'll find it because we've described it very well. And that you'll use the digital surrogate to the point where you feel like, now I need to see the real thing. And then you will visit us. And that actually has played out. Whereas, you know, we had thought that if we digitize it, no one will show up and then we won't have to be open every day, you know, which is, we want to be open more. And what we're finding out is that people exploit the digital copy as much as possible as they can, and then they want to come and see the real thing and see what else is there. And that's the ideal.
Yeah, the experience of the Huntington Library certainly bears that out. Since early English Books Online was created, the number of visitors who actually want to see the originals of those volumes has increased.
I had a comment and then a question. But I tell my students every day, I'm one of probably many of us in this room who computers came out in my lifetime, and even though there is a vast amount of information on the computer, I think in terms of how much information there is, it's just a tiny amount. So you really need to go beyond the computer. But my question is that many of you have argued that that the artifact actually has a kind of a different kind of being than the digitization, and that it seems to me that the digitization of it is epistemologically a very scientific approach. And so I was wondering, is there a need for a more complete or expanded philosophy of interpretation, of textual interpretation, or what's the influence of digitization on the theory of interpretation?
You're going to do that in your dissertation?
Sure.
Right. This is where we need our philosophers here as well.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes, though what it might look like is very difficult to say. I certainly think that as more and more material is digitized, we need to think in much more sophisticated ways about the metadata that we upload alongside the text. We need to pay much more attention, insofar as it is possible, to convey the materiality of the object as well as its content. And I don't think we've really started out on that road yet. I don't think. Your point about the tiny proportion of material that's out there on the web relative to the amount of information more generally is well taken. There are, in the Huntington collections, there are 9 million manuscripts. Less than 100,000 of them have been digitized.
Well, I think it's also clear from the discussion that digitization creates a possibility for new sins of scholarship. You know, the whole idea of lazy or keyword type of writing is a problem that didn't exist until search engines were available to make that easy. And so I think we're going to be evolving new norms of critical judgment, because that's ultimately the response of the scholarly community. People discover new ways to cheat, you know, in research or as students, and the community evolves new norms that push that back, and new ways of reading, because as Lorianne said, you can just see immediately, you know, if your eyes have gained that capability, that you're facing that kind of work. So So I think there will be new dimensions, maybe not a new critical theory, but new dimensions to critical theory that arise from that. But it's going to be a social evolution. It's going to take a while.
I actually remember when we first started with this, we were moving between the books we'd looked at in the library to their online EBO avatar or whatever, without actually, now there are, one of the first places you can see that this is beginning to evolve. Look at your style manuals from MLA, Chicago, Turabian. Now you actually, there are norms for which you show that you've looked at something online versus something in the library. And now with our sense of multiple editions and the different sorts of reprints, we're increasingly having to say where we've actually seen that particular book. That kind of, right. Day and time, absolutely, if it's an updatable thing. So think about already, just because we have to be accountable for our scholarship, the style manuals have begun to scramble, and that's going to push us to think about why our footnotes look the way they do.
Okay. So in keeping with the 50 years and also the 50 million number that we've talked about here, I'm thinking about the kinds of things machines do now, the kinds of comparisons and suggestions they make for me in my everyday life already, like, hey, you probably want to watch this, you'd enjoy this. And not only that, but shows that shows that I didn't realize existed on my 700 channels that I've only been made aware of because of, machines. And I think about, obviously we have like the cotton gin replaced how many ever people picking seeds out of cotton and whatnot. But with the 50 million number, I'm wondering if you ever see machines doing scholarship, especially if we think about the kinds of information you say we can collect with computers, not just the words, but, all the genomic, I don't even know what that means, but use that word like a couple times, it must be pretty fancy. But if, downloading this kind of information into databases, I'm just wondering, is there ever a scenario where we have like, the John Henry versus the steam shovel thing, where we have the last human scholar versus the group, the brain.
Huntington.
Yeah. I'm just, again, with the 50 million thing, obviously it's not around the corner. It's probably not in our lifetime, but is there maybe a moment?
Well, the short answer is I think values are going to come from people for the indefinite future. And so it depends on what we want. If people enjoy being scholars and they want to work with other scholars, then we'll keep having scholars. If people, people they weren't picking cotton and taking the seeds out because they wanted to. That was economic necessity, so there's no reason for them to continue. So there's still the political context, which I think is a crucial one. We could be forced into it one way or another, or forced into whatever context. But I think scholarship, obviously, as Lorianne said, we didn't go into it for the money, right? We didn't go into it for the power. We went into it because that's what we wanted to do. So my guess is, yes, there will be. Now, could you build machines to do scholarship? I'm sure at some point you could, but what's the point of, you could build machines to, ski or whatever, but what's the point of doing that, And
you'd get less hurt.
My thinking is that if you could build a machine to make you ski jump for 4 miles, you could still experience the 4 miles in the air, even though you weren't really doing it. I'm just wondering if computers could do, or machines could do better scholarship than human beings, eventually.
Well, my own feeling is that humans and machines together can do better.
Well, of course, the human has to build the machine, but then...
Not only that, but I think the human has to tell the machine what's interesting. Machines are not going to have judgment about what's going to be... maybe interesting to other machines,
50 million?
What's the point?
50 million times that they can't do this? I don't know, the 50 million number really...
And they're going to get their dissertations finished more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
A point about those media
splices.
Recommendations is that what you're seeing is actually aggregated human judgment. You're not seeing the machine independently watching the movie and saying, well, he'd like this one. You're seeing the fact that a bunch of other people, it's like Yelp. What are you getting with Yelp? A bunch of people who went to the restaurant and liked the food or didn't like the food or whatever. So that, I think, this goes back to what Lauren was talking about. There will be, I think, a great deal of improvement and I wouldn't call it democratization because I don't think it'll be a different way of forming an elite. There will be a lot of improvement in the speed and quality of peer review. You know, I think there'll be a larger community, and the community will be more, how shall I say, more transparent. But, you know, I mean, you don't get the people out of it. It's a human enterprise because it depends on human values. And if you took the people out of it, there wouldn't be any point.
Can I just make a quick comment about the peer review journal publishing issue? Yes, the traditional way, and I say this as the former editor of an international journal, so I've been right up against some of the pressures that Lauren was describing in terms of pressure to get more stuff published, pressure to accelerate the peer review process. One of the, well, you could say it's an unintended consequence, I don't know, of the way in which journal publishing has taken place in the past, was that essentially it's a competition for a finite amount of space in a peer-reviewed journal. And that in itself, to succeed in securing publication in Representations or the American Historical Review, is in itself a mark of quality. And I think my anxiety is that if journals become of infinite size, with an infinite number of papers accepted, where does the quality go? What's the marker of quality? And the other point that he raised about having revised or ongoingly revised versions of scholarly papers completely inverts the principle with which we've all grown up, that there is a fixed, definitive version of a scholarly position which others may wish to react against. And true, authors' opinions change over time. My own opinions have changed over time. I might wish to modify footnote 34 on page 232 of my article in Past and Present. But at the end of the day, that's the fixed version, and that's the one against which my scholarship will be judged. And that's got to be a good thing, right?
You know, I'm just thinking, the next panel we're going to have will be on peer review, the book without, you know, the expandable book, the expandable article. There was anyway, a wonderful lecture from someone who's in charge of the libraries at Harvard who talked about, you know, the fact that we really do have, we don't have scarcity anymore the way we used to. That there is a certain abundance in terms of people being able to, never get a microphone, you know, being able to perform their expertise, publish articles in which they know a lot. And, you know, there's that famous example about, was it Stanford people writing papers who weren't necessarily in the class, but they opened up the assignment to the sort of public at large, and it turned out that quite a few people who wrote assignments did a lot better than the Stanford students. They just didn't have the means to get into Stanford. They didn't have. So I think our notion, and what this fellow from Harvard said, and I wish I knew his name, he said, we are entering an age where anyone can learn anything, you know, in a number of ways. I mean, it's going to be.
But Wendy, we're also entering an age where I was actually asked to investigate something where, when I finally found, you know, taking it through a commonly held belief about a historical event, and people call the Illuminati, that factoid comes from the Da Vinci Code. All right?
Oh, sure.
Part of the problem is that what will we trust? I mean, what Steve describes.
Right.
I mean, I can see us continuing to revise what we think of as final versions, or continuing to revise what we think of as standards of excellence that make what we do worth doing because it actually has standards of excellence. But we're going to also have to be policing the boundaries of what's acceptable in a very open medium, because it is a little bit terrifying to be. I mean, if you work in religion, especially, where the facts come from are in very, come from, make sure. But you can actually trace 5,000 hits back to Dan Brown for 3/4 of what people think about the Roman Catholic Church right now.
Oh, well, yeah, but that's when we were talking earlier about new norms are going to have to evolve, new standards of authenticity. Yeah. Anyway, Janet has got to go. I wanted Mary to ask her question, and then we're all going to leave. Thank you,
Sorry
Janet.
to keep everyone late. My question is just about expectations for students. The issue of scarcity just came up, and students who have this sort of overwhelming access to digital archives, there seems to be more and more pressure to incorporate that access into their work. And do you feel like there is more expectation to have sort of a command of a wider reach of material because of this increased access to digital archives? I mean, I'm working in the 19th century, and the amount of material available is just, overwhelming. And at what point does the access become overwhelming rather than helpful?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I would say that there's actually a paradoxical relationship, which, I mean, I'm seeing more impoverished papers because of that. And I think it's because our capacity to deal with bounty, which is actually in some ways illusory. In other words, what you think is out there is dwarfed by what's actually out there.
Yeah, my mind can only hold so much
So
material.
learning discernment, focus, and thesis argumentation becomes even more important. So your style and your structuring of your thought cannot go out into the cloud. Right? If anything, it's got to actually, you've got to actually become a more disciplined and actually, it's not a question of being that you wouldn't be rigorous or disciplined now. It's that you have to fight against the notion that if there's anything out there, then there's nothing you can say, right? And so part of it is that you can lose your own instinct about how to keep a thread of argument under control. So I would say what's interesting to me is that given that people feel like they can Google and get a billion things, that papers are actually, essays and things can end up being quite thin in the humanities right now. And as we learn to corral and think through, how to keep our focus. So, stay small, go deep, right? That's all I got to say. Fewer ideas, more completely argued.
Well, thank you all very much. We stayed a long time. You didn't get a break. I appreciate your patience and your attention, and it was fascinating. And I can see, yes, and you asked wonderful questions, and I think we're going to be having more panels. I can see several more forming. Thank you so much for our panelists.